Snow blanketed the cliffs of Sierra Loba like a heavy, silent shroud. The air was so dry and cold it hurt to breathe, as if 1,000 needles tore through your lungs. In the midst of that vast landscape, a lone silhouette moved slowly, riding a black Mustang whose nostrils puffed steam into the icy air. It was Nita Redfeather, the youngest healer in the Apache community. She was barely 22 winters old, but her hands already knew how to tell the root that healed from the one that killed. That morning, before the first ray of sunlight touched the frozen rocks, she had set out alone. Not out of bravery, but out of necessity. Children in the camp were falling one by one with high fevers. Something was burning them up from the inside, and the herbs her grandmother, Ayla, had stored for emergencies were already gone. Only one plant could ease their symptoms: bloodroot, a rare species that grew only in the highest cracks of the mountain, where frost never fully let go. Nita knew that. She also knew climbing up there alone was a risk. Not even the strongest men in her tribe dared venture into those heights in the dead of winter. But fear didn't stop her. Her steps were steady, her heart even more so. When she reached a familiar rock formation, she dismounted. Buckshot, her horse, snorted uneasily as she pushed snow aside with her bare hands. The cold bit into her fingers, but she didn't complain. She was thinking of the children, their burning foreheads, their small bodies twisting beneath sweat-soaked blankets. She found the first roots, red, fibrous, potent. She tucked them carefully into her leather pouch and moved toward a deeper crevice. She remembered that in summer, the best ones grew there. She leaned in for a closer look. She didn't see what was coiled between the stones. A dull sound. A snap. The pain in her ankle was sudden and sharp. She jerked back. The rattlesnake, startled by her presence, coiled and gave one last warning shake of its tail before vanishing into the rocks. The bite had already landed. 2 tiny holes in her skin. Dark blood. The venom, thick as shadow, had begun its path through her veins. She knew. She had maybe an hour before her heart would start to give out. She tried walking toward Buckshot. Her legs refused. She collapsed to her knees. The world spun around her, a blur of light, ice, and pain. "No, not yet," she whispered. "The children, they're waiting for me." But her body wouldn't obey. She fell back into the snow. The sky above her was a blue lake that was slowly closing. The cold no longer hurt. Only the fatigue remained. "Ella," she murmured. "I tried." Buckshot came closer, sniffing her, nudging her shoulder with his muzzle. The horse sensed danger, urgency. He stepped back once. Then, without warning, turned on his hooves and galloped down the mountain. Nita was left alone. The wind licked her skin, as if trying to carry her away bit by bit. She thought of her grandmother's eyes, the children's smiles. A single tear, warm and defiant, rolled down her frozen cheek. "Forgive me," she said to the emptiness. "I'm sorry." Silence covered everything. Or so she thought. Because less than a kilometer away, Caleb Mercer, a man weathered by lonely winters and the echoes of the mountains, was slowly riding along the same trail. He was following the tracks of a black horse without a rider, and without knowing it, he was heading toward the moment that would change his life forever. The sun was just starting to peek between the snow-covered cliffs when Caleb Mercer halted his gray mare. The mountain silence was broken only by the crunch of snow under his boots and the wind dragging the cold like a curse. His gaze was fixed on something unusual. Fresh tracks of a horse running with no rider. It was a Mustang. He could tell by the size and depth of the tracks. But what unsettled him was the erratic pattern of those prints. The animal hadn't been wandering. It had bolted in fear. Something serious had happened. Caleb Mercer wasn't the kind of man to meddle in other people's business. He'd spent 32 years in the mountains, living in an old cabin he'd built with his own hands. No wife, no children. All he owned were his tools, his shotgun, his horse Daisy, and a handful of memories he never wanted to look at again. But something stirred inside him when he saw those tracks. He lowered his head, let out a long breath, and pulled on the reins. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "We can't just walk away from this." Daisy climbed uphill, following the trail of the black Mustang. Caleb's brow was furrowed, his eyes sharp. He was a man of few words and many silences, the kind who didn't need company to feel whole, but who couldn't turn away when someone's life was on the line. The wind howled, and the pine treetops creaked like old ships caught in a storm. After about 15 minutes of climbing, the trail led him to a clearing among the rocks. There, lying in the snow, he saw a motionless body. "Damn," he muttered, jumping off in one swift motion. He approached with caution, his heart in his throat. It was an Apache woman. Young, her brown skin stood out stark against the whiteness of the snow. Her lips were pale, her breathing barely there. Caleb knelt beside her. He touched her with the palm of his hand and felt the fever burning through her skin. Looking down, he noticed the swelling around her right ankle. 2 small red marks. Snakebite. The kind that kills if you don't act fast. No, he said, digging into his saddlebag. "Don't die on me. Not today." He tied his bandana just above the ankle. Tight, but not enough to cut off the blood. Then he pulled out some dried herbs, chewed them into a bitter paste, and packed it onto the wound. He tore a strip from his shirt and used it to hold the poultice in place. His hands moved with certainty, like someone who'd stared death in the face too many times before. The young woman let out a faint moan. Her eyelids fluttered. "You're alive," Caleb said softly, almost like a prayer. "Hang on, girl. You're not alone." He lifted her into his arms with the care of a man used to hauling logs, not people. She was light as a soaked feather, and yet something in her weight rooted him to the earth. As he hoisted her onto Daisy, he noticed the black Mustang watching them from a few yards away, still as a statue. Caleb gave a soft whistle. The animal stepped forward, calm, as if it understood its rider was now in good hands. "Well done, partner," Caleb murmured. "Now stay on our trail." With the young woman pressed to his chest, he turned the reins. He remembered an old hunting cabin not far from here. Solid walls and a fireplace. It would do. The ride was short, but it felt endless. The woman trembled violently, her body fighting the venom. Caleb kept talking to her, soft words, shapeless whispers, as if his voice alone might guide her through the fog of pain. "Hold on. Please." Just a little longer. When he finally spotted the cabin among the trees, Caleb felt a tight knot form in his chest. He kicked the door open with his shoulder, carried her inside, and laid her gently over some old hides near the hearth. It was a cold, empty cabin, but now it was alive. The fever was rising. So was the venom. Caleb knew the real battle hadn't even begun yet. He rolled up his sleeves, lit the fire, and stayed by her side. Not as a savior, not as a stranger, but as a man who, for the first time in a long while, felt like his footsteps had a purpose. The cabin shook with the wind. The walls groaned like old bones, and the smoke from the newly kindled fire danced slowly, searching for an escape through the cracks in the roof. Caleb Mercer crouched beside the flames and tossed in another handful of dry wood. The fire hissed softly, its light filling the room with a warmth just strong enough to fight off the night. In the corner, lying on a bed of hides, Nita Redfeather burned with fever. Caleb knelt beside her. Her face, slick with sweat, looked like it had been carved from wet stone. Her breath was rapid, shallow. She tossed in her sleep, murmuring words in Apache, names he didn't recognize. But he didn't need to understand. Caleb knew what it meant to call out for the ones you love when death circles close. He wet a clean cloth with water from his canteen and dabbed her forehead. Then he took her hand, firmly but gently, with quiet respect. "Easy now, girl," he whispered. "I'm here. You're not leaving tonight." He stayed there for a long while, listening to the fire, feeling his own heart beat like a restless drum. After some time, he stood and walked over to his saddlebag. He pulled out more dried herbs, the same ones his mother had taught him to use when he was a boy in the mountains. He crushed them with his teeth, formed a bitter paste, and gently applied it over the bandage that covered the snake-bitten ankle. The fever kept climbing. The venom still fought for every inch of her body. Caleb didn't give up. He talked to her, told her about his childhood in Carolina, about the long summers and the storms that rolled over the cornfields. He spoke of his father, a hard man with iron hands, of his mother, who healed colds with teas and humming songs. He spoke of why he left, and why he chose the mountains and the silence. "There was nothing left for me back there," he admitted as he changed the cloth on her forehead. "But then, you showed up." He watched her sleep with his eyes half open. It wasn't just her wild beauty that moved him. It was her resilience. She was fighting, and that was something a man could recognize when he'd survived abandonment, frost, and his own guilt. Time lost its meaning. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow and thick, as if trying to blanket the world. Caleb kept feeding the fire, tossing on more logs whenever the flames began to flicker. Whenever the wind howled, he answered it with more heat. He didn't sleep. Not for a second. Every time Nita trembled harder, he covered her with another hide. Every time she murmured, he answered with calm whispers. At one point, he thought he'd lost her. Her body went limp, her breath so faint it was barely there. But then, a sigh. A heartbeat. The fever hadn't given in, but neither had she. "When I was a boy," Caleb said hoarsely, "my mother used to say each of us has a guardian, a spirit that follows you in silence and guides you when you're close to falling." He looked at Nita's pale face. He touched her cheek with the back of his hand, not daring to go further. "I never believed in that. Not until today." He returned to his corner, sat on the floor, leaned his back against the log wall, and kept watching her. The fire's shadows danced across her face, mirroring the battle still waging inside her. The night dragged on. The darkest hour had yet to come. But Caleb already knew. He wasn't alone in that cabin. There was a promise there, unseen, but real. And if that woman managed to survive the venom, then maybe, just maybe, he could survive himself. The first ray of sunlight slipped shyly through a crack in the roof, brushing Nita Redfeather's face with a faint, almost maternal warmth. Her skin was still damp with sweat, but it no longer burned like embers. Her chest rose and fell, slow but steady. Something had changed. Caleb Mercer, who had sat on the floor for hours without shutting his eyes, felt a chill. Not from cold, but from relief. He leaned toward her cautiously. His calloused hand touched her forehead. Still warm, yes, but no longer aflame. And then it happened. Two dark eyes, like rain-soaked earth, opened slowly. Caleb didn't move. He looked at her the way someone looks at a miracle they dare not name. Nita blinked, disoriented. Her vision was still blurry, but soon she could make out the figure of a man near the fire. A white man. Beard of several days. Light eyes. Watchful. There was no fear in them, only a strange, wild gentleness. She tried to sit up. Pain pushed her back down. "Easy," Caleb said softly, raising both hands like a man calming a startled horse. "You're safe now." Nita didn't answer. Her throat felt like a nest of dry thorns. He noticed and offered her his canteen. She hesitated, looked at him, then at the water, then back at him, and drank. Each sip brought something back. Clarity, strength, memory. She remembered the bite, the fall, the cold, the horse fleeing, and then that voice. The same one now in front of her. "How do you feel?" he asked, slowly, like the words carried weight. Nita understood part of the language. White traders sometimes passed through her camp. She listened more than she spoke. She motioned toward her bandaged ankle. "Pain," she murmured with a rough voice. "But alive." Caleb smiled. A real smile. Plain, unpolished, like fresh-baked bread. The kind you don't often see on men who've spent too long alone. "Yes," he said. "Alive. The snake didn't win." Nita looked around the cabin. She recognized the fire, the hides, the bandages. She saw the crushed herbs, the damp cloth still dripping beside the hearth. She understood what he had done for her, and she understood what that meant. Someone had kept watch over her longest night, without asking for anything. "Thank you," she said. Just one word. But in her tongue, in her tone, it carried centuries of pride, and humility too. "You don't need to thank me," Caleb replied, lowering his gaze. Anyone would have done the same. But both knew that wasn't true. He walked over to his bag and pulled out some food. Dry bread, a bit of cured meat. Nita ate slowly, silently. Caleb didn't look away. Not out of mistrust, but from that strange mix of awe and respect that only arises when you witness something fragile yet unbreakable. After a while, she pointed to her chest and said, "Nita." He paused for a second, then nodded. "Nita," he repeated, testing the name like it was sacred. Then he pointed to himself. "Caleb." She echoed it too, and the sound of it on her lips sparked something in him that had been asleep for years. They tried to speak, with gestures, broken words, pieces of meaning that didn't always fit, but were enough. Nita traced little children in the air with her fingers, touched her forehead as if to show fever. She murmured, "Sick. They need plants." Caleb looked at her, understanding instantly. "Your people. You're a healer." She didn't catch the word, but she understood the tone. She nodded seriously. "I must go back." Worry flickered across Caleb's face. "You're still weak. The venom's not gone yet." Nita tried to rise, stubborn. Her legs trembled. She wavered, and sank softly back onto the hides. Caleb steadied her with strong hands, but didn't force her. "Please," he said. "Just one more day. Then I'll take you myself." Nita looked him in the eyes. She searched for a lie, found only weariness and truth. "One day," she finally said. And so, under the flickering firelight, they began to understand each other, without speaking the same language. The morning air smelled of damp wood and thawing earth. Outside, under the soft midday sun, The snow began slowly retreating from the edges of the roof, as if it knew it was no longer welcome. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, but no longer as an emergency. Now it was warmth. Nita Redfeather slept with her eyes half open, breathing steadily, her body finally free of the poison. Caleb Mercer, standing in the doorway, stared at the trees without truly seeing them. In his hand, he held a small block of wood. With his knife, he carved without rush, without a plan, letting the shape emerge on its own, like a memory slowly revealing itself. Nita woke when the light spilled fully through the window. She sat up with more strength than the day before. Her legs were still weak, but no longer trembled like branches in a storm. She walked to the fire, dragging the blanket Caleb had wrapped around her. He turned at the sound of her presence. "Morning," he said, not moving. She nodded silently. Caleb offered her a piece of hard bread and some dried meat. They ate in silence. From time to time, their eyes met. They weren't searching for answers, just presence. In that lost corner of the world, not many words were needed. After they ate, Caleb sat by the hearth again and resumed his carving. Nita watched him, her curiosity quiet but clear. His fingers were big, clumsy at first glance, but the way the knife moved was delicate, almost reverent, as if he wasn't carving with force, but with respect. "What are you making?" she asked in a low voice. Caleb held up the piece. It was still rough, but you could already see it. Outstretched wings, a bird in flight, an eagle. "For you," he said. "So you remember this day." Nita lowered her gaze, unsure what to say. No one had ever given her a gift without expecting something in return. No one had offered her anything not out of duty, tradition, or need. Only Caleb. Only this strange, stubborn, solitary man. The rest of the day passed with unexpected calm. Caleb went out to chop more wood and tend to the horses. Buckshot, Nita's Mustang, didn't stray from Daisy's side. Not even for a moment. The animals seemed to understand each other better than most people did. Meanwhile, Nita took her time walking slowly around the cabin. She needed to feel the earth beneath her feet. Her ankle still hurt, but it no longer controlled her. She touched the bark of a nearby tree, closed her eyes, gave thanks in silence. As the sun began to set, she returned inside. Caleb had already lit the fire again. He was sitting, still carving, more focused now, closer to finishing. Nita sat across from him without asking permission. He looked up and showed her what he held. The eagle was complete. Each feather, each curve, each line had been carved with care. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Like the things we don't say, but feel. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't reply. He simply nodded. That night, silence settled between them like one more blanket. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared, as if both of them understood that this borrowed day they'd given each other hadn't been just a passing moment. It had been an unspoken pact between two tired souls. When they lay down, she on the hides, he near the fire with his knife in hand, neither wished to be anywhere else. Because sometimes the calm of a single day is enough to heal an entire life. Dawn came sooner than expected. The sky, tinged with pale blue, signaled that the time to part was drawing near. Nita Redfeather had risen before the sun. Her body responded with more strength, and though the bite on her ankle still ached when she put weight on it, it no longer held her back. In the improvised mirror of a pot filled with water, she studied her face. It wasn't the same face that had fallen into the snow. It was the face of someone who had come back. Caleb Mercer was outside, saddling the horses. The mist of their breath mingled with the animals, and the silence between the two of them had changed. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was a field sown with things left unsaid. "The horses are ready," he said when he saw her appear in the doorway, wrapped in a fur blanket. "Thank you," she replied, without fully meeting his eyes. They mounted without words. Buckshot, Nita's Mustang, seemed eager to return home. Daisy, Caleb's mare, walked with calm, steady steps. They began the descent along the same trail she had taken days before, seeking life and nearly finding death. For more than an hour, they rode in silence. Each bend in the trail brought a new wave of thoughts. Caleb replayed every gesture from the night before. How she watched the fire, how she touched the carved eagle as if she were feeling it from the inside. Nita, for her part, felt a knot in her throat, one she couldn't name. Maybe gratitude, maybe fear, maybe something else without a name. When the tribal lands began to peak between the mountains, Nita gently pulled the reins. "This is far enough," she said, dismounting. Caleb stopped Daisy and looked at her, puzzled. "My people don't trust outsiders," she explained. "If they see you, it won't be safe." He nodded. He understood. Perhaps more than she realized. Silence returned, but now it carried weight. Nita lowered her gaze. She wanted to say something. Anything that might serve as a bridge between the world she was returning to and the one she'd found in that hidden cabin. "Caleb," she began. He interrupted her gently. He dismounted, walked over to her, and with an awkward but steady motion, pulled a small blue stone tied to a leather cord from his pocket. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She told me to give it to someone special. I want you to have it." Nita stood still. He stepped closer and placed the necklace around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin. Just for a moment. But it was enough for everything unspoken to gather in that single touch. Nita took a deep breath. Then, with trembling hands, she removed her own necklace, a piece of turquoise and silver, weathered by time, passed down through the women of her family for generations. "In my people," she said, "this is only given when the paths of two souls can no longer be separated." Caleb opened his hands and received the gift as one would receive sacred ground. "When spring comes," Nita added, locking eyes with him, "return to the place where you found me. I'll be waiting." He didn't answer with words. He just nodded. Firm. A silent promise. Then she mounted Buckshot, turned around, and began to ride away. She didn't look back. She knew that if she did, she might not be able to leave. Caleb watched her until her figure vanished among the pines. The wind howled through the trees. The necklace in his hand felt heavy, like a vow. And somewhere deep inside, something in him began to move too. Nita Redfeather rode slowly down the final stretch of the trail. The winter sun glinted off the snow as if blessing her return. Her figure was steady, upright on Buckshot's back, but her chest trembled quietly inside. The weight of the necklace Caleb Mercer had just given her still hung warm around her neck, burning like a living promise. She didn't dare look back, because if she did, something inside her might shatter. The forest began to open into the lowlands where her people lived. She knew this land well, every stone, every dry branch, every hidden ditch. It was her home, or had been, until the silence and warmth of another cabin had taught her that feeling safe could exist elsewhere too. Buckshot whinnied suddenly. His ears twitched, alert. Nita's brow furrowed. "What is it?" she whispered, running a hand along the horse's neck. Then she heard it. A howl. Long, hollow, sharp. Then another. And another. Wolves. Not one. A pack. 7 shadows emerged from between the trees, gaunt with winter hunger, ribs showing, eyes burning like coals. They surrounded the path, blocking the way, as if they knew exactly where she would pass. Buckshot reared. Nita gripped the saddle tightly. Her wounded ankle screamed, but this wasn't the time for pain. The wolves growled low, circling. One, larger than the rest, stepped forward, nose lifted, paws rooted in the snow. It seemed to size her up, to sniff, to decide. Nita had no weapons, just a blanket, a pounding heart, and buckshot. She tried to turn, but 2 more wolves cut off the path. They were trapped. And then, like the wind shifting direction, hooves thundered through the snow. A sharp, dry gallop split the silence, and a voice rang out, deep, fierce, familiar. "Back!" Caleb Mercer burst through the trees like a lightning bolt. In his hand, he held a burning branch, taken straight from the cabin fire. The flames crackled, spit, roared with him. He placed himself between Nita and the wolves, without a second's hesitation. The torch blazed like a living tongue in his grip. He swung it wide, fierce, defiant. Caleb's eyes never blinked. The largest wolf leapt. Caleb turned with a speed born not from instinct, but from fear for someone else, and struck the beast hard across the ribs with the torch. The wolf fell into the snow, shrieked, and staggered back, howling. The others hesitated. Fire, ancient enemy, roared from the hands of a man who would not flinch. "Get out!" Caleb shouted, his voice like a gunshot. "Not today!" Nita couldn't look away. She watched Caleb move like a tree in the wind, strong, flexible, filled with restrained fury. He, who was always calm, was now a storm. One by one, the wolves stepped back. Then another step, and finally they vanished into the trees. The snow remained, scarred by tracks and salvation. Silence returned. Only the crackle of the still-burning torch could be heard. Caleb turned to Nita. His chest heaved, his eyes bright with exertion. "You all right?" She dismounted Buckshot without a word, walked toward him, and there, under the same sky that had been a threat just moments before, she placed her hands gently on his face and kissed his cheek. Soft, warm, just enough. "Spring," she whispered, almost like a breath. "Don't forget." Then she mounted her Mustang again and rode off toward her people, without looking back. Caleb stood still, hand still on his cheek, the burning branch at his feet. And as he watched that woman disappear into the snow, he knew, without a shred of doubt, he would cross 100 mountains just to feel that moment again. The winter sun hung low over the mountains, as if it too didn't want to leave just yet. The snow, trampled by wolves and marked by hooves, had lost its perfect shine. And amidst all that natural disorder, Caleb Mercer remained still, his face lit by the fire's fading warmth, and by something else he didn't know how to name. His cheek burned gently, right where Nita Redfeather had kissed him. It hadn't been a lover's kiss, nor a goodbye. It was an ancestral gesture, silent and pure. A gesture that asked for no reply. For a few seconds, everything paused. The wind, the shadows, even time. Buckshot vanished into the trees, carrying Nita back to her world, one that Caleb did not belong to, and perhaps never would. But what they had just shared couldn't be erased, and it wasn't meant to be understood with the mind. Caleb picked up the burning branch, now reduced to glowing coal, and tossed it into the snow. A soft hiss, and the flame was gone. He mounted Daisy without a word and began the ride back to the cabin. Slowly, as if every hoofbeat were part of a quiet morning. When he arrived, the place looked different. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The hearth still warm, the hides in disarray, the carved eagle resting on the table. But there was an air of absence clinging to the walls. He took the carving in his hands, ran his thumbs over each feather, then placed it beside the fire as if giving it its own sacred place. Afterward, he stepped outside and sat on the wooden step in front of the cabin. He stared at the horizon until the last light faded. He didn't speak a word all night, but inside him, something spoke without rest. On the other side of the mountains, Nita reached the camp just as night was falling. Her people rushed to surround her the moment they saw Buckshot appear. There were tears, sighs, embraces. Grandmother Ayla held her tight, not with scolding, but with the kind of relief that wise women can never quite hide. "You made it," she whispered. Nita nodded, tired but steady. She handed over the roots, her hands still trembling. They immediately began preparing the infusions for the sick children. Nita stayed close, watching, helping wherever she could. There was no time to rest. Her people needed her. But that night, when she finally withdrew alone to her corner of the teepee, she closed her eyes and touched the necklace around her neck. Caleb's. She hadn't taken it off since he placed it there. And there, under fur blankets, surrounded by the night sounds of the Apache camp, she thought of him, of his rough voice, his careful hands, the way he held the wood, the way he faced the wolves. It wasn't just gratitude, and it wasn't some foolish fantasy. It was certainty that some bonds don't need ancient roots, that 2 days, a fever, and a shared fire are enough for two paths to leave their mark on each other. Nita didn't cry. She didn't need to. She simply closed her eyes tight and repeated to herself the only words she'd spoken before leaving. Spring, don't forget. And so, in 2 different corners of the same world, a man and a woman, separated by snow and custom, held on to the same memory, a kiss on the cheek, and a promise without a date, but with a destination. Days passed like the thaw, slowly, silently, but changing everything. Winter still clung to the mountains, but not with the same grip. The shadows grew shorter. The snow no longer crunched under boots. It began to soften, melt into water. Spring hadn't arrived yet, but it was in the air. At the wooden cabin, Caleb Mercer opened the door each morning and looked out at the same horizon. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, but he waited. Waited the way one waits for rain after a long drought. Since Nita Redfeather had ridden away without looking back, something had remained suspended in Caleb's chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't nostalgia either. It was a different stillness, like time had rearranged itself around that kiss, that promise. He didn't grieve. He didn't talk to himself. He didn't drown in longing. He simply lived differently. The eagle he had carved for her still sat on the shelf, where he had placed it that last night. But now, Caleb worked on a new one, larger, more detailed. He spent hours on it every afternoon, as if carving a prayer from wood and steel. He also began fixing the cabin, reinforcing the walls, patching the roof, cleaning the chimney. Not because he needed it stronger, but because someone might walk through its door again one day. He gathered dry branches for the March fire, prepared fresh blankets, even left space beside his cot, like a man who doesn't need company, but hopes for it. During that time, not a single day passed without thinking of her, of how she looked at him before she rode away, of how she spoke the word spring, not as a command, but as hope. He didn't know if she would return, or when. But he didn't need to know. There was no danger now, no trace of wolves, only greener trees, new branches, and the echo of something that had never broken. He dismounted and sat on a smooth rock. He waited. The day passed slowly. The sun climbed. The wind changed directions more than once. The birds kept singing, but no one came. Caleb said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Maybe she won't come today, he thought. Maybe she'll never come. But there was no anger, no sorrow, only that earthy acceptance that comes to those who've lived long enough to understand. Not everything you plant blooms in the same season. Just when he began to think about heading back, he heard it. Soft, like a whisper through the branches. A light trot. Then, a familiar whinny. And then he saw it. Buckshot moved slowly along the trail. On his back, Nita Redfeather, wrapped in a new blanket, different from before, but with the same calm dignity in her expression. Around her neck hung the blue necklace he had given her. On her wrist, a braided leather band with green beads, the Apache symbol of joined paths. They didn't greet each other. They didn't need to. She dismounted without hurry, walked over to Caleb, and without a word, sat beside him on the same rock. For several minutes, they did nothing, just breathed the same air, staring at the horizon without needing to find anything. It was Nita who broke the silence. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "And you came back." She looked at him, a gaze that didn't ask for explanations, or the future, just presence. Then, Nita placed something in his palm, a seed wrapped in cloth. She didn't say what kind. She just whispered, "For you to plant here, where it all began." Caleb held it as if it were a piece of his own heart. And in that clearing where once there had only been ice, a new story began to take root. Not with a promise of flowers, but with something deeper. Because some stories don't need farewells, they just need a place to remain. In silence. And you who have come this far know this well. Have you ever waited for someone, not knowing if they'd return? And what if the real answer isn't whether they return, but what you became while you waited?